Okay, welcome back to the American Lit Lectures on the history of American literature. We're moving on now to the next time period, and that is the time period of the Revolution. It takes place roughly between 1750 and 1800. It's the Nationalism time period. That's what we call it. That's what designation we're giving it. And again, the dates are somewhat arbitrary, but as you can see, it encompasses the American Revolution. Now, it's important for us to kind of understand what's going on in England at the time, in Europe, because we're a colony. We're obviously affected by what's going on in our motherland, our native land. And what was going on in England and in Europe at the time was something called the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment. And we had the British Enlightenment and we had the American Enlightenment, and they were the same in many respects, but they had some differences. Ways that they were the same was that thoughtful men, philosophers, scientists and such, and statesmen started to believe that rather than focusing only on God and faith and religion like the Puritans did, they felt that they could reach a truth through reason, through using the intellect and the mind. And further, they felt that they could obtain order through science and order through government. So there was a lot more emphasis on the state and government than there was on a belief system and God, as was going on in Puritan times. And this is a picture of a man conducting a science experiment. There was a lot of trust in the ability of human beings, the ability of mankind to really solve and answer all of the problems of the universe. That there was that concept that it was within our reach, that was in our intellectual power, and we could do it if we just kept at it. And so it was a very optimistic time period. Now, when we talk about what's happening in our country, a couple of things we need to pay attention to, one of which is the American colonies were vastly prosperous, were very, very successful. And in fact, the colonies were experiencing much greater wealth and prosperity than Europe at the time, certainly than England. And that caused some problems, as you can imagine. One of the problems it caused was creating kind of a unified front and having kind of the same approach and the same policies from a colonial standpoint so that they could stand strong in their representation with trade and with Great Britain. There were a lot of economic and political implications that went along with that increased prosperity. Now, because there was an increased sense of unity and there was a need for that increased sense of unity among the colonies, it created some common issues. I mean, they had the same problems, whether they were a New England farmer or a southern plantation owner. They were still dealing with a lot of the British oppression. Because the colonies were so successful and they were a colony of the Great Britain Empire, the British Empire, Great Britain wanted to tap into that and definitely wanted to place trade embargoes and taxes and laws and all of those kinds of things. And really, in many respects, like a parent scolding a naughty child, saying, you know, you're getting too big for your britches over there. We want to make sure you know who the boss still is. And so we started to have, the colonies started really needing to have a need to communicate with each other over vast distances. Certainly they couldn't call each other on the telephone. They couldn't look each other up on the computer. They couldn't do any of those things. So they had to really look at ways to communicate effectively with each other so that they could present a united front to Great Britain. So who was writing during this time period? Well, interestingly enough, this time period is the birth of democracy, and that is translated very nicely into who was writing at the time. Really everyone was writing during that time, and if you had access to a printing press and the money to buy the time and the paper and the ink, you could publish something and you could get it out there for anybody to see. There wasn't a whole lot of control going on, so you had to take the good with the bad, but definitely people from all walks of life were writing. It was a very democratic process, and it's a good thing. Because of that, we were able to have a lot of political documents printed, broadsides, pamphlets, so on, to get the information out to the people, again, to make that communication powerful and strong. There's a posting a broadside of some speeches that someone decided just to publish and post on a wall or on the side of a building or to pass out for people to see. Here's an example of just some colonial verse written. Never was often very good, but as you can see, it has a little bit of a rhyme to it, and it's a good representation of the democratic sort of anyone and everyone can publish. Why were they writing? Well, as we said before, they were writing to unite the colonies. The colonies had a great need to present a united front to Great Britain, and this is a famous graphic that you've probably seen before with the colonies labeled there: New England, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Vermont, North Carolina, South Carolina, and join or die. Basically, if we don't stick together, we're going to just be a bunch of fragments and we aren't going to make it. Obviously, to communicate those common ideas, to fuel political independence. And as the time frame went on, during this period, it became more and more important that we get the word out about the independence movement. We also, during this time, were writing to start to develop our own American identity. Up until this point, and actually all during this time, we're still writing with what we call a voice that is more European than it is American. We're starting to develop and morph into our own culture over here in America during this time, but we don't have yet a true American voice, and we're working on it. We'll get there. Well, what were they writing? I showed you some examples of what they were writing before. One of the things that's important to note is that it is not always professional. It was not always sophisticated writing. We had, like I said before, things called broadsides, which were really very much like what you'd see maybe when you walk around the high school and you look at the posters that people post. And it could be for anything. It could be for just presenting an idea. It could be for advertising a club meeting. It could be for advertising a speech. It could be the lyrics to a song or a poem. Often they were just big one sheet of paper that would be plastered on the side of a building or on a post, or maybe even handed out in the streets. Essays. People were writing essays like crazy. Hey, I have a great idea. I want to share it with everybody, so I'm going to write this essay and publish it. And people were reading it. Remember, people didn't have a lot to read. It wasn't easy. You couldn't go to the Barnes & Noble. You couldn't get on the internet. So this was a form of occupation, of entertainment as well. Newspapers, and there's an example of a Boston or Massachusetts newspaper, the Massachusetts Sun, or the Thomas's Boston Journal. Definitely newspapers. The birth of the American newspaper was during this time. Songs, as I said before, poems, and that's actually a throwback from the last lecture. That's actually a collection of Anne Bradstreet's poems. And letters, of course, are still important. And pamphlets. Pamphlets became very popular and a great means to communicate all of those political ideals and ideas that were necessary, again, to fuel the revolution. Speaking of fueling the revolution, I want to introduce you to Mr. Thomas Paine, who was a radical Englishman. He was born in Great Britain and lived many years there. He was really the resident troublemaker, and he had just about every job you can imagine in Great Britain at the time. And Benjamin Franklin found him one of his travels, and he said, "Wow, you're cool. You're really interesting. You're well-spoken. You're articulate. You can write well. You can speak well. We need a guy like you in the American colonies." So Thomas Paine, being sort of the radical that he was and kind of spontaneous, said, "Cool, it sounds like a great idea to me. I don't like what's going on over here anyway." So he headed on over to America, and England was probably, at the beginning, happy to see him go. However, one of his most famous pieces of writing, called Common Sense, a pamphlet, fueled, in many respects, the revolution. It had very strong, very powerful, fiery rhetoric, and probably by the time it was all said and done, Great Britain was hoping that maybe they could have held on to him, and maybe he wouldn't have caused so much trouble for him, because he was a massive mover in the revolution. He first published it, though, anonymously. He wasn't quite sure how it was going to be received. He might have been a radical, but he was in a foreign place. So once it gained popularity, then he claimed responsibility. So yeah, by the way, I was the guy that wrote that, and he went on to write other things and become quite an influential person in the American Revolution. And here are some excerpts from Common Sense. This first one says, This new world hath been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe. Hither they have fled, not from the tender embraces of the mother, but from the cruelty of the monster. Notice the diction there, the word usage, monster, cruelty. And it is so far true of England that the same tyranny which drove the first emigrants from home pursues their descendants still. Quite strong language. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. And there's that sense of fueling the revolution and spurring people on through the difficulties. We fight not to enslave, but to set a country free, and to make room upon the earth for honest men to live, obviously implying that in Great Britain were not honest. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. And there it is, that sense of empowerment. The American colonies had the money, and they had the brains, and they could pull it off. But they needed some motivation, and common sense definitely fueled that. All right, well, that common sense was actually very well written. Not a lot of what was written during this time would qualify as something called literature. So what do we say? What is being written during this time of American literary value? Well, there were some revolutionary documents that were quite well written, as well as some nature writing that was going on, some writing about the natural wilderness, because clearly this was still a new enough land. And there was a lot of it that we hadn't explored yet, that we really needed to get into and understand. And so the natural wilderness became a way for us to have a literary voice and a literary conscience. Some of the writers of the time, you should know these, were Thomas Jefferson, who was not the only, but certainly the most important and main writer of the Declaration of Independence. We've already talked about Thomas Paine. Benjamin Franklin, I mentioned. He really deserves more than just a mention. Not only did he write Poor Richard's Almanac, he wrote so many very strong and powerful documents. He was also one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, probably the most brilliant mind, actually, of that time. Joel Barlow wrote something called The Hasty Pudding, which was one of those poems. It was rather humorous and definitely a great form of entertainment for the colonists. Phyllis Wheatley, another woman and actually a slave of George Washington, wrote many religious verses and poems and songs, and they published them for her, probably because she was associated with George Washington and very devoted to the man, as it was too. Philip Freneau wrote satire and poetry, and Jean de Crèvecoeur wrote a very interesting book called Letters from an American Farmer. He was a Frenchman who came over here and said, hey, I'm going to try out this new colonial life, wrote from the perspective of an American farmer. He kind of took a pseudonym, so to speak, and when it was all done and he made a lot of money, he went back to France and ended up dying there. But he certainly is also a representation of American writers of the time. This is just a picture of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. You'll see that the authors were Thomas Jefferson, who was the main fellow, and we're going to actually be looking at the Declaration of Independence soon here in class, so I'll be looking forward to that. Another author was John Adams, as well as Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. This is an excerpt from de Crèvecoeur, the Frenchman who came over here, and as I said, he named his book Letters from an American Farmer. And he really does a great job here of defining what an American is. Before we have a country, we have a group of people who are calling themselves, refining their identity as being American colonists. And so he writes, he is an American who, leaving behind him all his prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men, whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. And how prophetic that actually was. It is from this piece that we get that concept of, which is not always correct in our interpretation, but that concept of a melting pot, that we just have a great big conglomeration of people from all different lands kind of joining together. And this was written pre-revolution. So. And finally, we have Noah Webster, who wanted to weigh in on the whole concept of the American way of speaking and writing and of communicating. Because as I said, we still were holding on to European ideas. But Noah Webster said America must be as independent in literature as she is in politics, as famous for the arts as for arms. And during this time period, we didn't get very famous for the arts. We were too focused on the arms, and that's what we needed to do in order to give birth, basically, to our nation. But shortly after that, in the next unit, we are going to look at how America begins to develop her own American voice and her own literature and become famous for the arts as well. All right. Thank you for listening.